Welcome everyone. We'll get started because we always run this show on time, if you haven't been before. This is the next seminar in the Research Skills Seminar series, and for those who've attended before, you'll already know this, but for those who haven't, we throughout the year cover over 20 different topics within the research process, things that we think are really important. And in just an hour, for you very busy clinical people, wherever you may be, we try and give a broad overview. So we obviously can't cover everything, but we do the very best we can, and we point you to additional resources where we know about them in the handout, such as useful articles and other websites and other training opportunities where we know about them. So given the hour is very important, we have a wonderful speaker today, Elizabeth Chester, and Liz is the Director of External Affairs at Telethon Kids Institute. And that means that she leads a whole range of teams that support the Institute in things like communications, media, fundraising, community engagement, and she works with researchers to really help maximise the impact of their research results, and that includes for very broad audiences, including policymakers and families. And of course, Liz comes from a really experienced background, so she's worked as a broadcast journalist, a producer with Channel 7 and 9, and she's also worked in the State Government Media Office. So we're very, very lucky to have her speak with us today, and please join me in welcoming her. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sue, and always delighted to be invited to do this seminar. It's a wonderful opportunity to give a very short overview of a few of the things that I've learnt along the way in my nearly, can I dare say, 20 years at Telethon Kids Institute, and been able to work with some really amazing researchers at that time. Can I just acknowledge that, of course, we are on Noongar Whadjuk Butja, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and the joy I have in working with some very talented and amazing Aboriginal researchers in our quest to actually make sure that all kids in Australia have great opportunities. All right, so today I'm going to focus mainly on media, not because that's what communication's about, but because probably it's the pointy end of communications, and if we look at that end, it gives us a lot of ideas for some of the things which perhaps are a little less scary than media. We'll talk about why you would bother engaging, what do they want, what do you want, which is also really important, give you some tips and techniques, and we'll touch just briefly on social media, but as most of you will know, social media in itself could be a whole 1 hour presentation, although you're apparently not supposed to do anything more than 8 seconds on social media, are you? All right, why engage with the media? We engage with the media fundamentally because of reach. Reach is a communications term about how we actually get out to as many people as we possibly can. And despite all the things around social media particularly, and the other many communication channels that we can explore, mass media in Australia today still has mass impact. So we like to use mass media to frame and to be able to reach a lot of people, and then use all those other strategies to reinforce what's being done. We of course want to do it for advocacy, for public health and for children, particularly in this environment. Reinforce the value of research, recruit participants obviously is a big one. They need to actually understand what's going on. The translation of research into action, education, policy, raise the organisation and the researcher's profile through achievements. That's pretty good when you're trying to get funding and other stakeholder support. And if there's any doubt that you think that it's not important to communicate with the general public, well, it's actually not a choice. It is in the Code of Responsible Conduct. So actually communicating, disseminating your findings, engaging with community are not optional. They are things that responsible researchers are required to do. So when we're talking about the media, let's just define what it is that we're talking about. So print media, you've got your metro, your community, your regional and your special interest print media. Print media is not dead, but it's probably been reinvented more online. So I think online media and print media are actually very similar beasts. Radio is the underloved media, and yet I think one of the most wonderful opportunities for people to tell a story. They always talk about theatre of the mind when they talk about radio, because you can paint a very strong image around what it is that you're trying to do. You can show some personality about who you are, and often in the right sort of program program, you can tell a longer story. Sometimes when we're trying to do things like television, we're limited because the pictures are limited. But when we can actually talk more broadly, that gives us much more opportunity. We're going to focus, as I say, mostly on those platforms today. All right. Usually the biggest shock that comes to researchers when I start talking about prepping them for media is how short the things have to be. Now, I respect PhDs, I respect theses, and I want you to say it in 10 words or less. Tricky, isn't it? It's about seeing the forest for the trees. So a lot of grabs for media, you firstly need to start seeing it as an exclamation point. It is not the exclamation. It's not the explanation, it's the exclamation. It's the bit that's going to be used that's going to reinforce what they've already told. So unless you're actually really talented about saying those things on the spot, it's the sort of thing you really need to prepare for. How are you going to condense 10 years of work or 10,000 words of explanation into something that's really catchy, something that's going to reinforce and distill what it is that you're trying to do? And again, it takes preparation and it takes practice. You can see from that table there that you get a little more time with radio, which is why I'm such a fan of radio. And if you get a live interview, it's really a lovely way to engage. Or feature stories in newspapers, but even then, they're becoming a bit of a thing of the past. You could say that we're the victims of the news we consume. People don't read long form much anymore, and therefore not much long form is written. As a journalist, makes me really sad. Okay. What does media want? Now, I feel relatively well qualified to say this because I've spent 30 years as a news producer. So even up until December last year, a weekend every fortnight, I would go into Channel 7 and produce the news, make the decisions about what was going to get into the news and what wasn't going to get into the news. I always sort of compare that to still staying on the tools, making sure that the sort of messaging that I'm giving to the researchers that I work with is not stuff from 10 years ago, because media is fashionable, it changes. Things that were stories 10 years ago are not stories now, so we have that sort of variety. So what makes news? Awards can make news, but they've got to be pretty big. So they're not a bad opportunity to tell a story again. So if you've got an award coming up, you should let your communications team know so that they can actually leverage that in some way. Fame and power, of course, always makes news. So if somebody very famous does something very minor, that will get reported on, and someone very minor does something really major, it's much harder to get it reported on. Not fair, but it's the way it works. I always compare it to the fact that if I have a little bingle in my car, it's unlikely to make the news. But if some high-profiled person, say the Premier, had a little bingle, didn't even get injured in his car, it would probably make the news. Who you are makes a difference. Another reason to be building your profile in a good way. The unusual makes news, you know that. We've all clicked on clickbait, haven't we? The stuff which looks a little bit weird out there. I would hope as research organisations that's probably not something, although there is some weird stuff in research, isn't there? There's some really, you could frame it that way, there's some really interesting things that are quite surprising. My gorgeous lab researchers tell me about some fabulous shapes and things that happen in laboratories, which again, framed in the right way, almost giving a personality or a character to some of the molecules that they're looking at, actually can actually tell quite a cute story. Something new, now that's our heartland. If research ain't new, why are we doing it? It's new knowledge, isn't it? So I think that's very much the frame that we want to set into, and it's something which gives us a really comfortable space to be working in. Can you please not work in controversy? That's much harder. Sometimes it's unavoidable, and sometimes you can use controversy for positive outcomes, but controversy is probably an area that if you're going to go into, you want to go in with your eyes wide open with plenty of preparation. That doesn't mean don't get involved in issues. I think as research organisations it's really important that actually we use the evidence that we have to inform on issues, particularly sometimes if they're controversial because there's not the right information. Now some people would say even things as simple as vaccines would fall into that category. Timeliness, timeliness, timeliness. Old news is not news. So, one of the greatest challenges any communications team, I'm sure at any of the hospitals, universities or institutes like ours have, is the researcher who tells you that they had a really great paper published a month ago. Or worse still, when you've got a journalist on the phone talking to you about a paper that you knew nothing about, that they're wanting to do a story on that you've had no preparation and you don't even know what the background to it is. So Making sure that you're proactive in getting your media message out is really important. I'm sure all the communications teams would love a little heads-up email which says, I've got a paper that's about to be accepted or just accepted, would really love your advice if this is something that we can make a media story out. Be proactive, be early. They'll give you really good feedback. They'll go, maybe not this one, if it moves to this area it might be good, or it might be too early in the research for media. But there's nothing worse than the surprise phone call at 4 a.m. in the morning, because that's Eastern States time, wanting to know about a great piece of research that your organisation knew nothing about, and you've missed a beautiful opportunity to engage with stakeholders, to potentially raise your profile, and to actually really thank the people who've contributed to your research. Events can make news, but not often. Proximity. Talk about that, because proximity really matters, particularly in a very parochial state like Western Australia. So we can have something, if it's West Australian, it's always going to get higher profile. If I can take the flip side and you think of a disaster that happens in your suburb matters a lot to you. Happens in your city, you think about it. Happens in your state, you care. Happens over east, your interest is starting to wane. Happens internationally, you might not have even read the story. Now, that's the way it works. Is it right? Probably not. Is it reality? Absolutely. So part of our challenge in our research is actually to localise it when we're putting it out as media stories. So, for example, if your study involves trial sites on the East Coast, or if it involves trial sites around the state, then make sure that you're looking at those sort of opportunities both regionally and nationally as well. Disaster and crime we like to avoid. There is a saying, if it bleeds, it leads, and they're not talking clinically, they're talking about crime and disaster. That's what you see on the front page often. It always gives me great pride and pleasure when we're able to get a really positive research story off the front, onto the front page, and push off some of those crime and disaster stories. And then picture stories. I'm going to talk quite a bit about this throughout the presentation today, about the power of pictures and really how you can visualise your research in a society that is more and more picture driven is going to be really important, because a lot of it relies on you gathering as you go. So thinking about the sort of visual opportunities that are happening as you do your research will mean that you've got a lot more to work with at the end. All right. So when people are talking about doing a media release, what they usually present you with is a whole pile of facts. Now, without breaking your heart, can I tell you the facts alone do not make a story. If you want to read facts, read an encyclopedia. It's not engaging unless it's rarely even interesting, and you know that because you have to read lots of journal articles. Often it's not the facts that are important, it's the opinion, it's the commentary that makes it really interesting. That's what we look for when we look for news stories. It's the facts as your basis, but then it's the opinion on the facts. It's the emotion that comes from it. That's why so often having a case study that's affected by the research is so crucial. The drama, sometimes that can be the quest to actually get those answers. The struggles of the research along the way can actually make for a better story. And there's that word again, pictures. So anybody who says, just give me the facts and that's the story, is wrong. The story is made up of a whole lot of elements, and again, as you go in that with your eyes open, you will know that that's what your journalists are going to be pushing for when they start to talk to you about what does this research really mean. All right. It might not sound very sophisticated, but one of the first questions I ask researchers when I'm talking to them about their research papers is, who cares? And the look on their face is usually quite confronting, but who cares? And that gives you a whole lot of ideas about where this should be targeted. If the research is something which is only other scientists are going to care about, then it's probably not a media story. If it's something which is more mechanistic, which is actually going to inform other researchers, so important work, please don't be offended that it's not a media story. It's important for what it is, but the audience is not mass media. Whereas if what the research you're doing is going to, well, not even have an immediate impact framework, because sometimes the long-term research can also be really interesting. Who cares if you're a family with a kid with a chronic disease and this is early stage research? They will still care that this progress is being made. So just really defining who your audience is and who cares is really important. Why is it important? What's the problem you're trying to solve? How would you articulate that? How will it help in our perspective, kids or families? Who am I trying to reach? And then why should they care? If you start thinking about those, you're really starting to think about the elements of what a media story might be. Now, completely opposite the way you'd frame writing up your research, isn't it? And so it's really understanding that the two are not the same, they're very different. All right, what do you want? May I be presumptive and suggest that most of the researchers I talk to, when they're talking to me about media for their papers, they don't want fame. They certainly don't want fortune, because they're probably in the wrong profession if that's the case. What they really want to do is to actually make an impact. They want the research that they've done to actually affect something, to do something. And this is where media is just a marvellous vehicle for being able to do that. So I just want to take you through a couple of examples of where we've been able to work with researchers who've done very good research to actually ensure and assist them in making sure that their research actually had impact. So that's Alex Larkham. He does a lot of research in e-cigarettes, and he had an article published in the MJA which really identified that even the nicotine-free e-cigarettes actually had a whole lot of toxins and nicotine that you actually wouldn't want to be ingesting. Now, as a result of that and the publicity we did around that paper, the very next day the TGA put out a warning people about the dangers of nicotine-free e-cigarettes. So he was able to raise awareness. He was then able to contribute to the public policy debate there have been on, there's a lot of pressure and pushback, you may be aware, to actually have e-cigarettes legalised again and sold, and that was really good in terms of actually having a policy outcome. So Alex, he made impact. Carol Bauer, one of my favourite researchers that I've worked with for a long time, has lots of stories around the impact her research with her colleagues have made. Carol, if you don't know, was one of the team that did the seminal research around folate and the first public health campaign. So the folate tablets or supplements that we take before pregnancy, I must say, to prevent neural tube defects. That was part of the work she did, but she didn't just do the work, she actually really advocated strongly for years, not just for supplements in a public health campaign, but then for the mandatory fortification of folate into bread making flour, so that even those who weren't planning to fall pregnant would have opportunity to have that public health benefit. The latest thing that Carol's group has been involved with is really about preventing the damage done by alcohol in pregnancy. And the team works a lot in FASD and works a lot in those areas. But the pointy end of that again is, what are some of the things we can do to raise awareness? Now, when you're taking on the food industry or the alcohol industry, you need to have a pretty thick skin. And as part of a national coalition, after a lot of work, we were successful last month, I think it was, to make sure that there was mandatory labelling of alcohol products in Australia with pregnancy warnings. So it might seem like a small step, but actually, like the warnings that started on cigarette packets and all those things, it's a really important thing to be able to have it front and centre at the point of intake, that people realise that actually this is a substance that could potentially harm an unborn child. So again, the research that she did, the evidence that she provided, the testing she did on what different labels did, as I say, Carol and her group, because I know she's actually very humble and always very keen to make sure that the rest of her group are acknowledged, that changed policy, that will change practice. This is an interesting one. This is a gorgeous story around the research you do where you get an unexpected outcome. So you may remember, and many of you may have done in school, the virtual infant parenting. So you get a baby to take home that cries and weps and does all those things, and apparently is supposed to be a intervention to prevent teen pregnancy. Now, our group did a research project that was eventually published in The Lancet, which actually showed that pregnancy rates for girls who'd been through this intervention were actually higher than those who hadn't. So instead of preventing pregnancy, there was an unintended consequence that actually they thought the babies were gorgeous and maybe they could do it, potentially. So when that research was published, you can imagine it was pretty controversial, because a lot of people had invested a lot in these programs, and it went against what was the common sense approach that surely if you've gone through those hard nights with a baby that wets and cries, that would put you off as a teenager being a parent. We had calls from around the world, internationally, and a whole lot of programs were changed as a result of that research. Again, they made impact. This is one of my favourite front pages of the West Australian, and this is diabetes research. And I think it's a real challenge for us, for kids, particularly with chronic diseases, to actually not always present them in a negative sense. I love the joy and the exuberance of this, and this is really around the closed-loop insulin delivery, the pumps, and that these kids are more able to lead more normal lives, the importance of exercise for kids with diabetes, but being able to image them as teenagers with a really positive picture made a positive front page. Now, if that was a really dry article about we found this therapy to be effective and hadn't actually said these kids are about to be on camp, they're all going to be together, talked up a picture opportunity, it probably would have been buried on page 35 and not the front page. That's the power of a picture. And I'm sure in many of the research you do, there are gorgeous families and kids who really could be focused on to show the benefits of research and how it changes lives. I think this is my final one. I think you get my theme here, that actually it can make a difference. This is an oldie but a goodie. And one of my favourite ones with Fiona Stanley, where there was a swimming pool study which was done, which really looked at the impact of swimming pools in remote communities on skin and ear health particularly. And the research came back and it was published, and the reports were sent to various ministers' offices around the country and made zero impact. As we were looking at the strategy to continue to engage with community in an ongoing research project, we looked at taking up the Australian newspaper and the 7:30 report to really show some of the positive strategies around remote communities and communities which were really, engaging and controlling their own health outcomes, and part of that was the other benefits that came from swimming pools. Now, this gorgeous picture, again, with kids and Fiona on a front page, looks nothing like a research report, does it? But the phone calls we got from every Indigenous Affairs Minister around the country for copies of that report, which actually were already in their office because they were sent months before, made a difference. And it helped the conversation about not just the medical but the broad social benefits that actually come from having swimming pools in remote communities. It had a very strong impact because it was front and central to the decision makers who could make a difference. All right, so have I got you convinced now that you probably should do media and think about media in your research if you want to make an impact? So, within all the universities and the hospitals and the research institutes, there are media teams that will be very happy to prepare you for interviews. So I'm just going to make sure that I go through some real basics with you right now. But I would say don't try this at home. If you've got professionals in your organisation to help you, please do seek their advice. Rule number 1, don't ever do an interview just because a reporter's on the phone and in a hurry. It's a really great way to put your foot in your mouth and not think about what it is you need to say. You've spent years, potentially, growing your reputation, making sure that your research is done in all the appropriate ways. You don't want a hurried interview without thought to ruin all that you've built up over the years. Now, it may be that you only need 10 or 15 minutes. It may be that you need a couple of hours to make sure that you're prepared for an interview, but don't ever just do one on the spot. It's a recipe for disaster. So when you do that, you need to simplify your thoughts, as we've talked a little bit about before, in terms of you've only got a few grabs, potentially, and you need to talk about what's in it for the people who are listening to you. It's about your audience, what it is that they need to hear. So I always say, and this is really, really hard for many people, is 3 points. You've got 3 things you can say. If there's 3 things you could say that you wanted people to take away, I would say very rarely is that a fact. Generally, the 3 things that you would say is what can you do with that fact? So if it's a piece of research, it may be that there's an intervention that you are recommending, or it may be that there's a policy outcome that you are pointing towards, or there is a further aspect that you want explored. Don't waste your time with just regurgitating the facts. Include them in, but think, what are your calls to action? What is it that you want people to do based on the facts? And there it is again, think pictures. What are the visuals that you can be suggesting that takes your story from page 35 to a potential page 1? I am a strong believer of putting things in writing. That doesn't necessarily mean that we always need a media release, but making sure that busy journalists who are new to what it is that you're talking about have a few cheat sheets to be able to know that what they're saying is right. Remember, they're not the subject matter experts, you absolutely are. So I say there can be a lot of pain and suffering in media releases, getting rounds of sign-offs and whatever, and they have their place, don't get me wrong. But sometimes even for informal media things, I would follow up with an email just outlining again what some of the key things are and putting it in writing so that there can be no dispute as to what it is that you're really talking about. That doesn't mean a really long email, that means probably a couple of paragraphs, but just reinforcing things in writing is a really good idea. Always be aware of surrounding issues. Context is everything. So let me think of something that would be current at the moment. If we were, there's nothing more current than a pandemic. So the whole, if we were doing any sort of infectious diseases story right now, I would expect that there would be some thread drawn to what we know about how infections move in community, and you may get asked some questions around what's happening with the pandemic. That doesn't mean you have to answer them, but understand that that has framed and changed the way that we think about infectious diseases, and in fact, beautifully about the way we think about medical research in this country. It's a really, if you've got to find a positive out of a really huge negative, the positive is that we've got a community now that's really interested in medical research, talking about vaccines, understanding infection and how it spreads, and really has an appetite to understand more about what we do on a range of different levels. But make sure, this is another reason not to do your interview straight away, make sure that you know what's around in your field, in the area, before you do an interview. And also make yourself accessible. There have been many times when people will give an interview and then disappear into a seminar or something for the day. If you do an interview and somebody wants to check a fact, you do have to make yourself available. People love to criticise when journalists get it wrong, but I think it's in everyone's interest to help them get it right. And that means making sure that you're available as needed. All right. Not everybody loves doing interviews, and I'm not suggesting that everybody should. Peter Doherty was our keynote speaker last year for our Governor's Lecture at Telethon Kids, an absolutely delightful man. Little did we know then that his talking about pandemics was going to be something that we would be living through in the following year. But he's got a very wry take on the media, which I'm going to share with you now. I don't agree with everything he says, but have a little listen to this and see what you think of it.
My immersion in the media came very suddenly and at a fairly advanced age, and that is when I was awarded the Nobel Prize at the age of 56. And subsequent to that, in the following year, I was Australian.
Out of the room, but not in the room. Just when I thought I was all prepared.
My immersion in the media came very suddenly and at a fairly advanced age.
So,
and that is when I was...
Is there a volume control on these? There is volume. So source, and I'm going to suggest that one.
On the bottom of the video on the left, yes, there was also a...
it was right in front of me, was it? Sorry.
If you look down the bottom right, there was a...
Do you know, I can't see that because I've got the little inset there, so I can't see that bit. Can I? Apologies, everyone.
You'll see it. If you look behind you, you can't see it there. No.
I see. There we go.
There. Oh, it's up pretty high.
Yeah, no, it's through the system because I checked that that was up.
My immersion in the media came very suddenly and at a fairly advanced age, and that is...
I promised Sue that I wasn't going to have any technical issues.
It's okay.
That's up as well because I checked both of those, so I think it's actually through the system. You know what? I'm going to tell you what Peter says. And on your handouts, there's actually a there's actually a link to Science Media Savvy, which is actually a really good website, and these videos are on there. So what Peter talks about is that he doesn't like media, he doesn't want to do media, but he understands that he has to do it, that it comes with a job and it's part of the responsibility. He also suggests that not everybody should do media. And what I find really interesting about that... Should work now? Let's see if I've paraphrased him well enough. Try again.
My immersion in the media came very suddenly and at a fairly advanced age, and that is when I was awarded the Nobel Prize at the age of 56. And subsequent to that, in the following year, I was Australian of the Year. So this was a totally new experience, and I was dumped into it, quite frankly, and I made a lot of mistakes. I got some things right, and gradually through that year as Australian of the Year, I kind of evolved a better way of dealing with things. But it was a tough immersion. I'm a research scientist. We work in labs. We tend to talk to people who think like we do, and we tend to read the media that makes us feel comfortable. So I was living in the United States at the time. I was reading the New York Times, listening to National Public Radio, watching the public broadcasting service on television if I watched television, and not interfacing with a lot of the other media. And I wasn't interfacing at all with the Australian media, which is at least as tough and as vicious as anything on earth. So it really was a new experience. Scientists have to engage with the media, or some scientists have to engage with the media. I wouldn't say that all scientists have to engage with the media, because some of us are not very good at it. I mean, you need to have a bit of humour, you need to be prepared to take a little bit of damage, and you need to be relatively clear in what you say. It's important to select people who are personable. I always say try and find an attractive young person to do that if they've got those characteristics, because I think that works best, and television particularly works a lot on personal image. On the other hand, I'm an old guy, and I'm all I've got, and I can't look any better than I do, so I've got to do the best I can with it. And I think the thing is to be open and so forth. But we have to engage, and the reason we have to engage is there's so much misunderstanding and misrepresentation of science.
Oops, there we go. So I think Peter, as I say, I think he's an absolute delight. And the one thing I disagree with is he said that it should be the young person in the team, the attractive person in the team. I disagree with that. As a news journalist or producer, I would have him and his credibility and his wry personality any day, because I think it gives a credibility and authenticity to what's being said. But having said that, there are some people who don't feel comfortable doing media, and despite the best training, may never feel comfortable doing media, and you know what? That's actually okay. It's as long as somebody can represent what it is that's being said. What I'm trying to get away from is this idea that it's a hierarchy, that actually the people who do the media are the most important. Absolutely not. Sometimes it's the people who can best represent the research that should do the media, and it shouldn't be seen as anything as hierarchical within a team. Let's think again about what are we trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve impact, we're trying to achieve recruitment. Then what we need is somebody who's best able to give that message. The other thing that I would say is a particular concern of mine is when I'm speaking with researchers, they go, oh, you just want me to dumb it down. I never want you to dumb down anything. I actually find the term quite offensive, because people who don't do science or don't do research are not dumb. They actually just need things explained in a simple, clear way. It should never be done to the level where it actually makes nonsense, and it should never be done to the level where it's inaccurate. And I think actually one of the great tests of intellect is how simple you can make a really complex message. And you think of some of our really good science communicators, they make an art of it. So nobody would suggest that what they're doing is dumbing it down. And I think if you come from that approach, then your messaging actually usually gets very skewed. What you're trying to do is make it as simple as it can be, but as good as Albert Einstein said, not simpler. All right, this will save you some pain. Remember, Nothing is off the record. So, and I tell you that because it's one of those favourite phrases that people love to bandy around. Said, oh, I was just talking to a journalist, I was telling them off the record this and that. Now that is the height of naivety and potentially stupidity to be able to talk like that. If I was a journalist and you tell me something, what do you expect me to do with it? Park it somewhere, put it somewhere if you're telling it to me off the record? If you're telling me something, under my code of ethics as a journalist, my job is to then try and confirm it on the record. So the first thing I'll start doing is making phone calls to see if I can get someone to go on the record with that. Now, a lot of people who bandy around the phrase off the record don't realise that. What off the record means is that I will not reveal my source. That's all it means. And there are journalists, even in this state, who have gone to jail for refusing to reveal their source. It doesn't mean don't use it. And a lot of people think off the record means don't use it. I've had my heart break after interviews where I've watched really good interviews finish, and then when the camera stops, somebody leans over to the interviewer and pats and goes, now just off the record, what you should know is this, this and this. What's that journalist going to do with that information? Just because the camera's off doesn't mean that the journalist is not listening. Okay, so most important thing to remember is nothing is off the record in the way that you might imagine. And if you do have some sensitive information that needs to be liaised with the journalist, then please use your communications team to do it. Don't try and do it yourself. It's a really carefully negotiated state to be off the record. And from the journalist's perspective, with some of that, if they're going to have to be prepared to go to jail rather than reveal the source, it would want to be pretty damn good information, yeah? The reason off the record is so dangerous is people use it to manipulate. And what do we know about anonymous information? It's less reliable. So most journalists, as I say, will not go with off the record information unless they can confirm it in some way. All right, now that I've given you the lecture on that, the other thing is to be aware of deadlines. The pace of media at the moment is horrendous. So there is a 24-hour news cycle, which means that almost every half an hour they are filing or having to update stories. Now that makes journalists a bit antsy and grumpy and pushy, or because they're trying to meet their deadline. Don't take that on board. That's not your problem, but it does explain some of the pushiness. What you need to do is be aware of the deadline, and if they're asking for something today, don't then deliver it to them a week later. If they're asking for something today, say, okay, negotiate a time. So I can't get it to you before this time, but I can get it to you by 2 o'clock, for example. Negotiate a time which is reasonable on both sides so that there's absolute clarity, and that's how you build a good relationship. There's those photo picture opportunities again. Think about that. Practice your grabs, your phrases. Think about examples, tangible examples you can give of what your research has done, achieved, or could mean. Personalise where possible. And that doesn't mean revealing patient confidentiality or anything like that. Those rules all still very much apply. But to be able to tell a story about a situation or an impact that it's had on you as a researcher or something like that really builds the power of the story. Never say no comment. Why? When did you last say no comment in real life? It's rude. It's really rude. There are so many better ways not to comment on something than to go no comment. It's a speak to the hand. And can I tell you, when anybody said no comment to me as a journalist, it's a red rag to a bull that I will do whatever I can to try and get them to comment on that particular subject. It's just rude. So there are many ways to say, look, I don't have that information in front of me, or I'm not able to comment on that because that data hasn't been published, or I don't have consent from the families to really talk about their situation. Give a reason, and then the journalist doesn't have a reason to come back to you and ask it again. But no comment is not an answer. And I always say, where possible, and this is even harder in our particular times, often meet the journalist or speak to them. What I really dislike is email correspondence interviews. There's no personality in it. There's no ability to explore the conversation. I think whenever you can pick up a phone or meet someone, they also get to know who you are. And you know in your own life, you connect to somebody, you feel a bit of a responsibility to them, much more than if you're actually doing an anonymous email conversation. So where possible, talk to them, meet them. Jargon. We laugh a lot at other industries because of their jargon, but I have to tell you, health and medical research is in a class of its own when it wants to talk in acronyms particularly, and when it wants to use some strange phrases. Now, I haven't gone in for acronyms here because I think you all know how dreadful they are. I'm still fighting for our researchers at Telethon Kids Institute not to call it TKI. TKI in the general public means absolutely nothing. It's great in a contract, no problems at all with it in a contract, but if you're actually trying to talk about where you work, be it the hospital, be it an institute, then use its name. Don't use acronyms for anything. But also be aware of how research language can be misleading. I remember when I first started and someone started talking to me about error margins, I thought, oh my God, they're the researchers. You'd think they'd get it right. Not understanding what error actually really meant. When you talk about manipulating data, well, that sounds completely unethical to me. That's tampering with data, in my view. But we know that actually you clean and manipulate data all the time. That's what happens. But understand that from a non-research perspective, those sorts of words can be easily misinterpreted. There's a little list there for you to be able to have a little think about what words you might use and how you might do it differently. All right, we've talked a little bit about key messages. You've got 3, remember? 3 key messages, and then you need to think about how you're going to use them. This is my magic formula. And because people often get their key messages and then do an interview and never use their key messages. And I said, well, what happened? They said, I just answered the questions. It's like, okay, where's your agenda in this? So this is the formula that I encourage people to use when they're doing interviews to make sure that their key messages get across. Now, politicians also use a formula, but they're missing one part of it. Can you guess what it would be? The answer, that's right. What they do is they just make point after point after point. And what happens with that is you get those really hostile, combative interviews where the journalist will ask a question. You would have heard this on World at Noon or something like that. The politician answers it, and it doesn't matter what the journalist asks, they're making their point. It's not pleasant to listen to, fun sometimes because it gets really crazy, but it's actually not an interesting conversation. I always say, answer the question to the best of your ability, and sometimes that might be, well, we don't have any data on that, but use that question then as an opportunity to make a point. So the question might be, well, what percentage of children are affected by this particular condition? And your answer might be, look, we don't really have good numbers on that because we think it's underreported, but what's really important to know here is that, there's something we can do right now, even without those numbers, to be able to curb whatever it's happening. So you just move on to where it is that you have to go. And there's lots of those bridging phrases. Can I encourage you to listen to some long-length interviews, be on the 7:30 report or AM or PM on the ABC, even on the project on Channel 10, and hear how people actually get their points across. It will give you some really ideas of how getting your messages into your interviews will really work. These are some of those control phrases which help you bridge back to what it is that you actually really want to say. There's nothing more frustrating that people say, oh, but the journalist didn't ask me the right questions. And having been a journalist for 30 years, I don't know what the right questions are. You can't wait for the right question. You have to actually answer the questions in front of you to the best of your ability, but make sure that you use that as an opportunity to make a point. I always encourage, and you've got this, I think, in your handouts, to make sure that you can always fill out a form like this before you actually it does have to be a form, but these are the things that you need to think about before you actually do an interview, that you know what the program or the publication is. If you're being rung up to speak about your research and it's the Channel 10 News, gorgeous. Good family audience, probably going to be a fairly light touch story. Think about your pictures. If you're getting phoned up about your research and it's Four Corners, then you'd have to actually think, what's the agenda here? Because they don't do sweet stories on nice research generally. It's because there's something else going on. So just knowing that would mean that probably your first phone call should be to your communications department regardless, to actually say, I've had a call from Four Corners, and then they can make the calls and start investigating further as to what that's about. Nothing against Four Corners. I actually think it's a fabulous show with really good journalists, but what I'm saying is who you're talking to makes a difference. Make sure you've got the journalist's name and number, because I've had times when people have actually wanted correct information but haven't known who they've spoken to. The subject, the visuals, again, have you thought about your visuals, location, other interviews, why do I put that down? Because in some areas of research there is contention, and if they're talking to somebody who actually holds an opposite view to you, that will give you an idea that you know that this is actually going to be that sort of story as opposed to just a straight exploration of what you're saying. So it doesn't harm to go, look, so interested in talking about this subject, who else are you speaking to? Doesn't do any harm at all to ever ask those questions. Your 3 key messages. And then I put a little thing about reference notes then, because I've had experiences where researchers have fronted up to do interviews and they have had this many pages in front of them. Or they've tried to do phone interviews and they've had this many pages in front of them. Can I tell you, you will never read or think that fast to be able to answer with that many notes. Put your messages down. If you're worried you're going to forget a particular name or a particular word, write that down and nothing more. If you're doing a TV interview, you won't be allowed to have it in your hand regardless, so make sure that you've got it in your head and that you don't go armed with paper. The other thing that happens, surprisingly, is people bring confidential information. They bring files. Now, there's filming that happens all around when you're doing TV interviews. It's not that they're deliberately trying to be obtrusive, but it can happen. So make sure that anything confidential is tucked away. There's nothing that shouldn't be on whiteboards. Be aware of the environment that you're in. I've put this one in because this is another interesting one around making an impact, and also how the altmetrics are really interesting. So this was one from last year with Gail Alvarez, which works in our autism team. And you might think the paper was fairly dry in terms of really arguing over how we classify or how we refer to people with different levels of disability with autism. And her argument was that high-functioning autism was a really unhelpful and offensive term in many ways. It went absolute gangbusters in terms of social media, in terms of Twitter, and what that resulted in for her was actually the paper becoming extremely highly cited. So it actually had a very direct impact, and I'm not sure if I've got the slide in here, but there is data that shows that highly tweeted and papers then become highly cited. Now, you could argue that, of course, they're good papers, therefore they're being tweeted, but there is a direct relationship between dissemination on social media and citation rates. So, again, another reason to get in the game. So this really just went through our approach. We did media releases, expert reactions, videos, and those that shows that it was in the top 5% of all research output scored by altmetrics. And there were 536 tweets. So it did go really well. That again, just you can have a look at this data yourself. But it was number 2 out of 1,000 outputs for that journal. So if you were a researcher with those sorts of metrics, you'd be pretty happy, I would have thought. But having said that, Gail worked with us for a month ahead of time to be able to get the media release right, to make sure that there was video. We were more concerned, to be frank, about how it would be received by the community and making sure that what was actually quite a subtle message was well interpreted. So we made sure the messages were right, had the right sort of supporting materials, and then it went out in a way that was actually received really positively. I include this one not as anything against the particular Eastern States Research Institute that it involves, but really as a warning, I guess, to all, that as much as I'm here, standing here saying, do media, it's great for your career, it's great for your funding, it's great for your dissemination, do it within the realms of your code of practice. And the NHMRC is very clear about what it expects in terms of the dissemination of research, and that does not mean overstating what your research does. There are departments around who will push to make the research sound beyond your comfort zone because they're trying to achieve a funding outcome or something. So not with malice or misintent, but really because there's not a respect for where this truly lies. So this, you might remember, was a couple of years ago, the headline on the West Australian was like Vegemite to stop miscarriages or something like that. And the research actually was very good research, published in a very good journal, showing in animal models that vitamin B3 could potentially treat molecular deficiencies which cause miscarriages and birth defects. So really good, high quality research in a good journal. But in animal models, very early stage, a long way from actually ever being a therapy, not even close to a clinical trial. But this was the research was put out by their organisation as a historic discovery, promises to prevent miscarriages and birth defects globally. They called it a blockbuster, world-first breakthrough, expected to prevent recurrent miscarriages and multiple types of birth defects in one of Australia's most significant discoveries in pregnancy research. Now, if you were going to say that, you'd really, really want to be sure that was true, wouldn't you? So the backlash against that particular article was quite unfortunate, and unfortunate for the research team involved because, as I said, their research was really good. But it was overstated in the public to the point where they actually had to put a statement out in the following days to tone down what it is that was said and to apologise for actually raising false hope amongst those who had repeated miscarriages. So, as I say, as much as I'll talk up the power of media and the importance of it, that wasn't the media's fault. That was a trusted organisation. If any of our organisations put out a media release, the media would take it on face value that what we say is true. So it's up to us, and when you're checking things, be comfortable with where it's at. Social media, I'm light on time, so very quickly, everybody thinks that in research, it's okay, we'll just do social media. Can I tell you, social media is tough, it is hard, and it's a lot of work, a lot of grunt work. So it's not about putting out one post and expecting a miraculous result. If you're actually going to actively involve in social media for your research and your study or the community that you're working with, you need to build a relationship with them. You need to listen to them as much as you tell them. You need to have storytelling. You need to be inspiring. And it's resource heavy. You need to post regularly. So a lot of people think it's a quick fix. It is fabulous, it is powerful, but it is not easy. Just be aware of that. And yes, you should still do it. Be really clear whether it is a professional page or your own page, particularly on Twitter. Very good to always make sure that you make it very clear that the views expressed are your own. Be credible and knowledgeable, only talk within your expertise. Don't fight on Twitter. It's a really short-term strategy and really bad for your reputation. I can't imagine a situation where you would want to engage in a public debate via Twitter. Very unhelpful. Interesting that social media these days is changing. It's becoming much more sophisticated. It has to be much more earnest, much more genuine. People are starting to see through the clickbait and the sorts of techniques which we used a couple of years ago. Facebook is not cheap and it is not free anymore. We call it a pay-to-play platform now. So if you actually want to be advertising for recruitment or putting out studies, generally you need to put an advertising spend for it. Facebook didn't make all their money because they gave free content. And the days where an organic post, as we would call it, would actually get lots of reach are gone. So if you are doing your budgets for your research and you have a dissemination aspect or recruitment aspect, budget for advertising on social media. Do not assume social media is free. I think the rest of video, the engagement we get on video so transcends anything else we do that, again, as you're preparing your research budgets, think about your dissemination techniques and your communication techniques and can you afford video. It doesn't always have to be flash, but you don't want it to look dodgy either because it's going to reflect you and your organisation, but make sure that you include some aspect for that. Trust is built in traditional media. I still say that because we find when we've got credibility surveys that people will still believe much more what they'll see on the television news or hear on radio or read in print newspaper or the news sites on Twitter than what they find in some of the other feeds. So again, put some of your effort into traditional media. It's not dead yet. On its way out, but not dead. Know your platform best for researchers. LinkedIn, of course, is really good for building professional networks. I know ResearchGate is also really popular. That's not where you're going to find your general public, but it's good for you professionally. Twitter is really good in terms of influencing policy, getting out to the media, making sure that your research is in front of the people who need to see it. And this was the article that I talked about earlier in terms of predicting citations. So if you're curious, go explore that one a little bit more. So social media quickly, it's content, quality over quantity. Don't spam people. Nobody wants their news feed filled up with content that's not relevant to them, but you have to actually put some effort into the quantity and the quality. Timing, relevancy, think about who's your audience and don't try and mix your audiences, and choose your platform carefully. Confidentiality. Don't forget that the fundamentals still apply. Just because it's social media or mass media doesn't mean that things like your ethical and legal responsibilities, your peers, your participants, your organisation or your funders, and most of all, don't post unpublished data unless you never plan to publish it in a formal journal. It can preclude publication. Defamation, I won't go into, but basically it's not something you're going to say to somebody's face. Don't say it on social media or anywhere else. People do think that they've got an anonymous right to say what they want. Just another little warning there. Copyright. Your papers, when they're published, there's copyright on that. You can't just put on your social media your papers. You also can't just rip music off the internet and put it on a video that you like. There are copyright and legal restrictions on these. Please, again, check with your communications departments. Sometimes my hair goes greyer than what it is when I see what some people do, and they're ripping stuff off the internet like you wouldn't believe. Imagery, graphics, recordings, it's not okay. There are plenty of free sites that you can get with proper attribution, but be very careful about what you use. All right. I'm not going to go through writing a media release right now because I don't think, so I want to give you a couple of minutes for questions. These things are all in your handouts, or you can get a copy of this to have a look. What I would say is plan as you go, make your life easier. Think at the start of your research what your communications and media plan is so that you can gather as you go, that you can share the load amongst different people within the team to have responsibility for it. A lot of people think of it just at the end when they're publishing a paper, yet there can be gorgeous stories along the way that really build the community, which build awareness of your research, that when actually you do have findings to come out, that people actually have an opportunity to engage with you in a much more deeper and meaningful way. All right, I wonder if there might be any questions.
Anyone have any comments or questions or experiences they want to share, or things they wish they'd done differently? Anything at all? Any comments from people offline, as in online, but not here? No, that's fine. Well, I'm sure Liz won't mind staying behind for a couple of minutes if you think of something as we wrap up. And can I just remind you all to please fill in your evaluation, which will be emailed to you as we speak. And we really value your feedback so we can constantly improve what we're doing. But please join me in thanking Liz for a really fantastic talk. Thanks.
The meeting is about to terminate.
You can totally tell when you compare like the rest of the stuff. Definitely was in the video.